Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today's video is sponsored by Warlord Games, who've sent along a Churchill for me to have a paint in preparation for their upcoming game Achtung Panzer. Now the Churchill was not, by the time it hit the European campaign, the most powerful gun tank out there, but it was nigh indestructible. This thing was a beast. So even if you aren't going to be knocking enemy tanks out quite so easily with the Churchills themselves, maybe pair them up with a Wolverine or an Archer, something along those lines, and let these take the brunt of the punishment. Now, the painting for this is pretty simple. The whole thing took me less than about 2 hours of actual work, and I'm going to show you a cool trick that you can get this grimy, muddy effect on the tank without having to shell out for expensive products. So all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. Alright, so before we even get to the painting stage, we're going to apply some of our weathering material now. And that is going to be this funky stuff here. It is baking soda. It is super fine, and it's going to work a lot better than trying to scatter full-size sand or something onto our Churchill's hull here, because using full-size sand, scale-wise, it's not going to look quite right. We want something almost invisible once it's dried, just enough to give us a bit of texture to our weathering. Now, I've just realized, really, I ought not to have opened it up quite like that. I'm popping down some PVA here. This is watered down a little bit from the bottle. And this is actually the container that the Churchill came in, just split open. It's not terribly absorbent, so it's going to work fine for this. What I've got is one of my scraggly old brushes. And just going straight over the plastic, you'll see because we're using PVA with quite a bit of water mixed in, it starts going a little bit scraggly almost straight away, which is perfect. Because we don't want perfect coverage. We want this to be a little bit uneven, a little bit of a mess. So really just jam it on there, a bit more in some areas than others. Then take a little pinch of magic and sprinkle it on quite messily over our hull. Now that's going to look atrocious until it dries and we have a chance to wipe some more of it away. But for now, you'll see how the baking soda actually picks up some of the stray wet and drags it down. Works very well for our simulated muck. So over all of the areas where you'd expect to see this, away we go. Let's jam on some of this awful mess. Now make sure that that's had plenty of time to dry thoroughly, and grab yourself a stiff bristled brush and just work off the excess. It will end up everywhere, so make sure even across the top of the hull you're giving it a quick brush. But areas towards the front, if you want to take some more of it off, you can get quite vigorous and scrub it off. But this, yep, that looks about right. Now, under a primer, I think you'll see how much of a difference it actually makes. It doesn't look nearly as grimy as it did when we were putting it on, and it's plenty of texture for the mud effects that I've got in mind for later. Although it is difficult to show you the front because the Churchill is so bleeding big. But that is that taken care of. When I've primed it, I've hit it with a spray of Russian uniform from Vallejo. Now they've got a primer can for that as well, which is super useful. If you can get your hands on it, I thoroughly recommend it because it is the perfect colour for British armour. Otherwise, you can use something like Death Guard Green from Citadel. Give it a couple of coats of either Russian uniform from the pot, if you can get that, or Castellan Green is quite similar. Try not to worry too much about 100% perfect. Better that it just look good. And as long as you're consistent across all of your tanks, the color's not going to matter all that much. But we're going to try and stick to accurate here. So Russian uniform, here we come. Now one more quick thing to bear in mind is that anything I do to the hull, I am of course also going to do to the turret. You're not going to see it on the camera most of the time because it's a little bit fiddly, so we'll pop that one aside and concentrate on the big bopper here. Now this time we're actually going to start by mixing up our shade. Now I quite like using Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian Medium, but for this kind of precision, I've always found it useful to decant them into a couple of bottles first. Don't worry too much about the size of the bottles. You can pick something up from Amazon or similar. The droppers are what's going to be important, because we'll start with 10 drops of Agrax Earthshade, and then the same again of Lamy and Medium. Now, I cannot stress enough, make sure that you label your bottles. And when it comes to Medium, I always add, one more drop for luck. So once you've mixed that absolutely senseless, we can apply this over the entire vehicle. Now, strictly speaking, we don't have to thin down the shade. I just find it useful to make sure that we're not seriously tinting the color of the vehicle. We are going to paint over it again in the next step, but the less sort of tidying up we have to do, the better. And when you do come to the sides, remember that gravity works. So when you apply this, it's going to flow naturally towards the bottom of the tank. Don't worry too much as it pulls down near the bottom, because some of your grime is going to catch it, and you can paint straight over the top of that. But if you get any big clods of it, what you can do is just guide it away with your brush and put it somewhere that you need it to be instead. So covering the whole tank in our Agrax mix. The poor white balance on my phone doesn't know what to do here, but once that is dried, either leave it for an hour or so, or snuggle it up to a radiator if you happen to have one going. You have your shaded tank, but that's looking pretty dark. So we are going to go to some Russian uniform from the bottle, and I've got one of my little round dry brushes here. This one's actually from the Army Painter. It is which is this one called? It's the Moderate Dry Brush. And I'm not worried about getting everything off my brush. I'm going to throw the bottle violently to the floor. What I'm going to do is start across the top of the hull here, and just start dry brushing those flat panels. Now you can modulate the color here as I had done on the Sherman if you've watched that video, and I do recommend it. It's quite interesting. But in this instance, I'm really going to do this quite quickly. As you notice, as you pass over the same area a few times, you pick up the flat panel with the color it should be, but you leave all of the shading intact. So, over the whole tank, away we go. Now quickly pop the turret on for a slightly better picture of the thing, but there we go. We've got our Russian uniform green over most of the tank again, but we have our nice shading intact. Now there is a quick way that I'm going to modulate these panels. Basically, we're going to overbrush pretty roughly, let's say. We're not going to do the little circular motions, that wonderful phrase that was done on the Sherman. Instead, we're going to blast through this fairly quickly. British armour, there we go. British armour is pretty quick to do. So mixing up our overbrush colour, I'm going to add 3 drops of Russian uniform to 2 drops of Iraqi Sand. Now you can do it equal parts. I just think slightly more on the green is going to look a little bit nicer for our transition of colour here. So let's mix those suckers together. And this time with a slightly smaller brush, we're going to overbrush areas on the higher parts of the tank. So across the top here is still going to be a prime candidate. I might have a little bit much on my brush here. Now this will look quite bright going on. So take your time and go over some of these panels just a couple times more so that you make sure you are getting a little bit more color onto them. But these big ridged areas are going to catch plenty of this. So have a bit of fun with it. When it comes to the turret, a big smooth top like that, just like at the front here, concentrating on areas where you're going to see more light catch. Now hopefully you'll be able to see some of that modulation in color, done very, very quickly, and it works pretty well across the whole tank. If you're worried about how much you're going to leave as you run your dry brush across the miniature, just buff it on the running gear first, because we're going to do so much to those that you're not going to notice any green out of place down there. So I'll pop the turret off again, and what I'm going to do now is I have mixed up a pretty decent amount of water, and this is burnt umber. Now these tracks, they were all metal. They didn't necessarily rust terribly badly, but they looked pretty grimy after a couple of days in the field. So I'm not going to paint the entire underside, but I do like to make sure that anything which a player might see is going to be adequately brown. And if you are feeling particularly fussy, you can get under the cover here to the exhaust system and add a little bit of that burnt umber, though I'm going to skip that bit, and I am instead just going to paint these two little nubbins sticking out the back with it. And while that dries, as long as you're careful, you can start painting in things like the base of machine guns, the tow cables, anything which is going to be like black and metallic. I'm using here German grey. It's a nice deep blue-black, and it's a little more interesting to look at than just an ordinary black would be. Now to finish off those tracks, what I have is some oily steel, although any gunmetal-y sort of colour will work perfectly well here. What I'm going to do is just lightly flick along the edges really with an old dry brush. I'm not too worried if I do catch some of the running gear, and I am, as always, going to go straight over the dust and grime that we added in our first step. Now before we do the grime wash over the tracks to complete the dirty effect that we've added, we're going to do the rest of our chipping and weathering first. So what I've got, this is a little bit of packing foam that I've torn up and folded over a couple of times, and a pair of tweezers that actually holds closed while you're not pressing down on them. Is super useful for this. This is German Camo Black Brown, and I'm going to start lightly using this along areas where we'd expect a bit of chipping and damage to form. So areas that are going to be crashing through the undergrowth, which might see a lot of crew activity, just dab very lightly with this. It is very easy to add too much of this quite quickly, so mind how you go. But I always like doing this. This is probably one of my favorite steps. Now I was about to have been a very silly sausage. Put your decals on before you do your weathering. So I haven't applied much of that German Camo beige yet, which is probably just as well. So I tend to find a little bit of kitchen towel just on my desk to hold and soak plenty of water. And that way, as I'm applying them, I can just leave these transfers as they are and come back and grab them with my brush as I need them. So with just a little bit of microset where the decal is going to end up, just pop that on and it should, I say should, just slide, there we go, off of the brush, and to straighten that up, just get a little bit of water and shove it where I need it to go. You can flood it underneath, and yeah, let's go ahead, pop all the decals on. And once those have had time to dry and settle, now we can go back to making our mess. The idea here is that anywhere that you are going to put down chipping, you want your transfers, or your decals, whatever you want to call them, in place beforehand, so that when you do apply a bit of mess, it's going to affect those naturally. So, whoops, don't follow along with me until you watch the whole video, basically. Now, for any tool handles that you do have on the tank, a little bit of beige brown will do the job. It doesn't have to be terribly complex here. Now with bright orange, we're going to do two things. First off, still up on the engine deck, what I'm going to do is just little blips of this on some of the burnt umber that we did, the exhaust system. This will go on looking pretty gross, honestly, but as it dries, it's going to give you a more accurate, sort of chalky, rusty effect. And if you put too much of it on, just smudge it with your finger, and job's a good one. Then what I've mixed up, this is more of that orange and about 10 parts of water. What I'm going to do is just quickly blast this over the tracks. It's going to look rancid going on, but as it dries, it's going to give us a much more subtle, sort of worn metal finish. So pay attention along the sides here as well. You'll see as that dries, it looks a lot more reasonable. Now I've already gotten a bit ahead of myself here. What I have is flat earth, and this is mixed roughly half and half with water, maybe a little bit more paint. What we're really doing here is just splodging down our first layer on the muck. Now here you can run around it a little bit. You want it to be quite splodgy. So a ragged old brush will help quite a bit. Anywhere that you're worried you might have put a little bit too much on or it goes over where you want it to, just run your finger down it and you'll get a pretty natural smudge effect. So over all of our mucky muck. And then just the same as pretty much everything else we've watered down in that way, it looks so much better once it's dry. What you can do, and it's not strictly necessary, but I think it does look a little bit better, is to grab yourself some fresh flat earth and without thinning it down, just stipple it around the actual kludgy, messy bits themselves. This will help the slightly fresher clinging mud look a little bit different to the dried, fallen off bits. Now we're looking the part. We've got plenty of texture, we've got a little bit of differentiation between the muck and the dried stuff, and if we spin them around, yeah dude, that's looking cool. Now what we're going to add is a last couple of touches of weathering. Now this stage you can very easily go overboard with. This is about 10 parts Lamian medium to one little dot of cavalry brown. And it's best if you test this somewhere that you're not going to see it later. So I'll just pop a little bit of that under there. No, goodness me, I definitely want more medium. So after a bit of experimentation, what we're looking for here is quite a runny mix that we can use to add a little bit of rust to some areas. And you want to be, like I said, you want to be fairly sparing with this because you can very quickly add way too much of this. Even Churchills, which saw a lot of time in the field, would have been quite well looked after. But all the same, a little bit of this run into the recesses of working parts will look quite cool. So keep a nice point on your brush. And as with everything else, if you've got too much on there, you can just rub it away with your finger quickly and all will be fine. So there with the turret attached, remember to do those steps on the turret as well. Yeah dude, we're looking pretty cool. There is one last weathering step that I want to do though. What I'm going to do from here is grab some Athonian Camo shade. Now on the Sherman that I painted last week, you would have seen me use a military shader with a little bit of medium mixed in. This is just so you can see a different way of doing it. What this is going to give us is sort of a rain streak effect. Just little thin lines of this running vertically from parts where you'd expect water to collect. It also, like this darker green, has kind of an oily finish. So if you've got any fuel caps, that's also a pretty good contender for a quick blast of this around them. Now depending on how you've assembled your Churchill, you may or may not have one of these big lamps up on the side here. So I'm just going to give it a quick coat of azure. And then what you can do is grab just a little dot of white and put one in opposite sides of the lamp, just to represent the light kind of refracting through that lens there. Now what I've got here, this is a 2B pencil. The softer you can get, the better. What I'm going to do is just buff along the edge of some of these little chipped areas to give us a bright, shiny finish without having to muck around with any paint. So there's a quick buff there, and you'll see it'll only catch the light from certain angles, but when it does, what a winner. So you don't have to do this to all of your chipped areas, but just the more of this you apply, the more recent and fresh those dings are going to look. So up to you how much of it you do. As well, this is a really easy way to just quickly buff the metalwork on the tools. And once you're satisfied that all of the little bits and pieces are done, you can glue your tank commander in if you have painted him. Now this fella I have painted using techniques in a video that I will link to in the description. He is wearing pretty much the same uniform as the British infantry. This fella, he is not in the funky onesie, the so-called pixie suit that the British tankers wore. So makes it nice and simple. So let's pop this thing up on the spinny thing and see if the Churchill is too big for some vanity shots. I think it might be. And so there at last, our Churchill is complete. This thing is a beast. It is one of my favorite tanks and I always enjoy painting them as well. I think I've got 4 painted so far. The plastic kit too from Warlord is pretty simple to put together, and the end result is going to look something like this, so definitely worth picking up. So thank you again to Warlord for sending along the kit for me to have a play with and add another of these beasts to my collection. As well, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my most glorious producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. You literally keep this channel ticking. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.